you had to be 100% on people's side on this. You had to agree that lockdowns were good, masks worked, social distancing was necessary, and the vaccines were the best thing since sliced bread. And any chink in that particular armor, and I didn't go for any of it, and you were cast out. You were a heretic basically. Yeah.
Roger Watson is a British academic and Honorary Professor at the University of Hull. He's also Professor of Nursing at St. Francis University, Hong Kong. He's written over 5,000 publications and has been cited more than 7,000 times. He is the Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education in Practice, and he was the founding chair of the Lancet Commission on Nursing. And he's been President of the National Conference of University Professors from 2022 to 2024. So Roger Watson, thank you for joining me today. What is the state of the NHS today? I mean, you can look back on it over a period of time. You can see how it's developed.
Yeah.
What's your assessment of it now?
It's in a terrible state. It really is. It's funny because once you're into that system, it seems to work pretty well. If you can get past the initial stages and you get into what's called a pathway there for diabetes or prostate pathways or whatever these pathways are, there's various ones. They seem to work very well, but it's getting into them and onto them that's the real problem. And I mean, the NHS, I think next year's budget is projected to be something like £192 billion for this year, this financial year. Yet the queues get longer. The more money that goes in, the worse it seems to get from certain perspectives. And it's very hard to know what the problem is. And I think it's probably multifactorial. I don't think there's any one thing that's causing this massive problem of millions of people, 17 million people on queues, waiting lists or queues essentially to get treatment. I think there's lots of things, because if we can identify one thing, I think then that would be relatively easy to fix. But the one thing that isn't at the root of it isn't funding, because it just gets more and more funding all the time and just performs less well. But I suppose various things over the years, working time directives may have had something to do with it. The NHS wasn't designed to do what it does now. It was designed to meet the needs of a fairly stable population. Of course, the population has grown in all sorts of ways, and it's got more people like me in it now who are older. That was never expected before. I'm 70 this year. When I was at school, you had your 70 years and 10, and that was it. But people are living much longer. We can do so much more, I think there's just lots of little things have accumulated to make this growing waiting list problem worse. But I think the final cliche, our nail in the coffin, was the COVID years. I think we just got too used to closing the NHS down for whatever reason. I'm not entirely sure. We may come to that, and
I'm
waiting grew
going to get on to the COVID years in a little bit later, if I may.
Yeah, sure, yes.
But I
We
mean,
never recovered from that, I don't think. I don't think we've recovered from that really. And money spent on other things. I mean, the money spent, there's a lot of talk of spending money on, diversity, inclusion and equality officers and all these kind of things. And we certainly do, but that's in the millions and not in the billions. And while I don't think we should necessarily be spending money on those things, or not so much money on those things, I'm not sure if taking that away would save the NHS. And then, of course, we do operations which are probably not necessary. Transgender operations which don't solve the problem of the mental health problems of transgender people. Lots of.
I'm going to come on to that as well later on, if I may.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So
The experience of the average person, I suppose, begins with the GP.
Yes.
I remember when I was a little kid, my mum, if I had a cut finger or something, whatever it was, she'd just take me off to the GP's surgery. No appointment necessary. You just turn up in the evening, 6 o'clock. You sit in the waiting room, you wait your turn, and you get to see Dr. Sam Harris, who would then fix everything for you and send you off. But nowadays, the experience for most people seems to be you've got to ring up at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. And
Yes.
if you don't hit exactly 8 o'clock, then you're
Yes.
in a massive queue. And then
Yes.
by the time you get through to the massive queue, they say, sorry, all the appointments have gone. Try
Yeah.
again tomorrow. And so the scramble goes on. How have we got into that kind of a state with even GPs?
I know that, I mean, that's the rate limiting step, I think, for people is getting into that. I'm a biochemist by training before I came into nursing, and everything's focused on rate limiting steps and how they're controlled because they control the whole pathway. But yeah, there's a terrible blockage there.
The main
You're absolutely
filtering
right.
system. Yeah,
Sorry.
it's a filtering process, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, and it's almost survival of the fittest. Those who can be bothered to stay on the phone long enough and listen to some inane, lounge music. Or on the other hand, those who will persevere online or on the dreaded app on the phone. And I mean, if you use the app on my phone to try and make an appointment, which I do out of frustration now and again, it simply doesn't work. It just says there are no appointments available, and often gives you that answer for weeks on end. And often what you just have to do is go down to the surgery and stand there till you get an appointment. But I mean, when we first came to the city we live in now in Hull, the practice that we still use had four doctors. It's got one now. We are really short of general practitioners. And of course, the waiting list has grown. They amalgamate with other practices, but all that seems to do is not add any more availability of doctors. It just seems to add people to the queue. And my wife was down yesterday, luckily in the system at the GP, seeing one of the practice nurses, and two gentlemen of about the same age as I was came in to try and make appointments through the receptionist, and they were both asked what was wrong with them by the receptionist. Both refused to tell the receptionist because they wanted to see a doctor. They were very polite, she said. They didn't say it's none of your business, but they said I'd prefer to tell the doctor. And because they wouldn't specify what was wrong with them, it seemed impossible for her to get them into some particular way of getting an appointment. It's just utterly bizarre. Um,
What is this? What is the solution? If someone from government were to say to you, Roger,
yeah,
sort this out, what would
yeah.
you do? I mean, how would you approach it?
Yes, well, we need more GPs. That's
More
for sure.
GP.
More GPs, but how do you achieve that? That's more easily said than done. And I don't really have a comprehensive or even a quick answer to that one. But I mean, GPs became managers of these businesses in certain reorganizations of the health service. And large amounts of money were dangled in front of them if they got the business right and got the business model right and got the right number of people on their caseload. But of course, they became managers and highly stressed and having nothing to do with patients. Many of them ended up appointing managers of practices who weren't really medics, didn't really know how to manage practices, and I just think the whole thing's gotten a mess. I think we need to get back to having doctors sitting in a surgery that people can turn up and see. And I really don't know how we get there, but we must stop doing what we're doing at the moment.
Do we need to slim down the bureaucracy? Have doctors been overburdened with bureaucracy the same way the police have?
Oh yes, exactly. I mean that was more or less my point, which I didn't make very well there. But yes, they've got far too much to do, far too much bureaucracy to deal with. I don't like to say far too much accountability, but far too much
Well, it's
paperwork to
back
fill in.
covering or covering one's back.
Yeah, but covering one's back, and nursing is very much the same. Yep. So they've got far too many other things to do, and of course, every, you know, everything's online these days, which isn't too bad. They can quickly access your files and all the rest of it wherever you've been in the health service. I think that is an improvement, although we've got to be aware of digital security and things like that. However, I've been to see my GP on the rare occasions when I've got through. He says, "Sorry, the system's not working today, so I can't actually make your appointment. While you're here, I'll take a note and I'll do it later." And I had an appointment for a very serious investigation, which turned out to be nothing, thank goodness, but it could have been, and it was missed. And if I hadn't chased up about 8 weeks later, I wouldn't have known that it hasn't been done, it's been completely forgotten about. So there's an over reliance on that sort of technology, the human face-to-face interaction has just been lost, really.
What about nursing? I mean, that side of it. You're more of an expert in
Yeah.
field. Has that improved since year 2000?
Well, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. I mean, there's two sides to this argument here. One thing for sure is that the increase in graduate nursing education, which is much castigated by people,
This is Project 2000 you're
yeah,
referring.
Project 2000 was just well, Project 2000 actually hit the buffers before the year 2000. It was when I was in clinical practice in about 1987. It was brought up. It was actually a Royal College of Nursing initiative brought up and adopted by the government, and that was 1987. And it was
This is the idea that every nurse should have a degree.
yeah, every nurse would have a degree level kind of training,
Okay.
and not necessarily in universities, but by 1999, all nursing education had moved to universities. And I have to say, I'm a fan of that because there is really robust evidence that if you have more graduates present in the workforce, you're more likely to survive your stay in hospital. The empirical evidence on that from the States, Europe, the UK, the Middle East, and I've been involved in some of that work myself, is crystal clear.
What do
Yes,
you say to those people though who claim that you lost the caring approach?
yes.
The people who came in before then were more dedicated to caring for others, and then that got a bit pushed to one side as the academic thing became more to the fore.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of how true that is, but I know that there's lots of complaints. I mean, I've got my own experience, which I wrote about in the Catholic Herald, of sitting in a having been rushed to hospital after having collapsed at home. Nothing particularly serious, as it turned out. Sounds serious, but it wasn't. And ending up sitting in a room for 3 hours, and my wife standing beside me with nobody even bringing her a chair. And that was purely the fault of the nurses. The ambulance staff were brilliant, and the A&E staff were brilliant, and the consultant was absolutely beyond belief, very, very good. The nursing staff just sat about and showed their Christmas photographs on their phones. So it was, I've had experience of that myself. So yes, I think something's happening that we just can't really explain. I don't know if it's a loss of the caring side, because I can look back into my own nurse training, 1982 to 84, and I saw some appalling things happening, both, and when I worked as an auxiliary before that, which brought me into nursing when I was a student at the University of Edinburgh, I saw some terrible things, abuse, milk, sugar, and tea going into the same pot, drugs being stolen by the staff, all that kind of thing went on. But some there seemed to be a catalogue of complaints about the way people are treated by nurses. However, and I'm not, obviously you'd expect me to defend the profession. I think a lot of the time that people say they've been treated badly by a nurse, it's not a registered nurse. The registered nurse is too busy filling in paperwork. It's a nursing assistant
Again,
who looks exactly like a nurse. You can't tell the difference these days,
yeah.
and nobody reads the badges. So I'm not saying that's always the explanation, but I have to say that certainly is sometimes the explanation.
They were always color coded in the old days. I think
Yeah, they
matrons
were
were
clearly
at the
color
back,
coded. They're
don't
not
have
so.
matrons these days, I think.
Yeah, not so clearly color coded these days, and they wear these these sort of appalling uniforms that they all look like sacks of potatoes in them, and they really don't have much. They really don't look very neat and tidy and professional, and they all seem to wear the same color. I cannot tell who's who. Sometimes they have an epaulet to indicate, but then you need a chart to tell what they do. So yeah, and of course, last time, it's a lot from personal experience, but last time I went down to have a blood test at the general practitioners, because I'm on a pathway. It was a nursing auxiliary who did it. She did it perfectly well, but of course she couldn't really answer any questions to me. I would have to make another appointment to have the results explained to me and so forth.
Nurses are stepping up into a lot of roles that doctors previously.
That's a
Yeah.
That's absolutely right, Philip. Yeah, there's what's been called a sort of compression of the job of nurses. They've been squeezed into this area, slightly more clinically responsible than they were before. and a lot of their jobs have been eroded from below by people who are not clinically qualified, who are not qualified nurses. Now, they can be perfectly good at doing their job, but they're not professionally accountable, and that makes an awful lot of difference. They can be sacked if they don't do something right, but they can't be prevented from going to work somewhere else unless they commit some terrible criminal act. At the same level, people like my oldest daughter, who's an advanced critical care practitioner, does the work of a senior house officer. I mean, has her own caseload, can discharge patients, can prescribe all the medications, and she still considers herself to be a nurse, but she's working at a level which is not quite with the patients who just walk in through the door. So it's there's that going on as well. So I think when people say it's all, the thing is that the graduate education was brought in concomitantly, so everybody kind of blames that. But I think many things went on, like this upskilling, difficulty in filling the workforce places, replacement by people who are not professional nurses. So I think there's more to it than meets the eye, really.
Let's go back to one of the comments that you made earlier on about things seem to go downhill a little bit from the time of COVID.
Yes,
And
yes.
from your point of view, how was that handled, and what are the mistakes and lessons from that time? What do we do right and what do we do wrong?
All right.
Big
Well,
question, Fred.
yes, we, we, we did absolutely everything right in COVID for about 5 days, when both Dr. Fauci on the other side, along with Donald Trump and Boris Johnson here, were saying there's no need to panic. This is a mild virus. We don't need to kill the economy. Carry on as normal. We're okay. And on both sides of the Atlantic, within 5 days, we were locking down. We were wearing masks, we were socially distancing, and hospitals were closing to all but essential care. I'm just, we probably haven't got time to go into what happened in those 5 days, and nobody really knows. So I thought I thought, hallelujah, we're getting it right at the beginning, because I'd actually been in Wuhan in early December, and nobody knew that there was COVID was about then, but it was around at that time. And I realized as soon as I got back that something was going on. And, looking at the figures that were coming out of China, it was clear that this was just like a flu. Older people who weren't so well were dying of it. And
Did you notice it? You said you were in Wuhan at the time, or around
yeah,
about
just
the time
just
when it broke out.
beforehand, yes.
Did you
Yeah.
notice anything happening in Wuhan
Yeah.
then? Because we had these videos from
Yeah.
China where people walking along the
Yeah.
street and just
Yes.
dropping down dead
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
something.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
Was that
Exactly. They were completely fabricated. I'm absolutely sure of, well, I know they were completely fabricated. People don't collapse and put their hands out as they're falling. And it was so obviously faked even looking at it. No, and those videos were supposedly released from, before it all began, kind of before 2019. This had been going on in Wuhan for ages, and the Chinese had been suppressing it and so forth. Not at all. I mean, I was there for 5 weeks up until the beginning of December, first week of December. I traveled freely around China by train. I went around Wuhan to bars and hotels and got on with my work just as normal. And after I came away from Wuhan I'm not exaggerating, for a year afterwards, I checked up with my colleagues there and said, "Have you had COVID? Have you got?" And not a single one had COVID. I'm not saying that COVID doesn't exist. I'm not on that page at all, but not one of them had COVID. So I was very doubtful about the
were
whole.
these people in the laboratory, or are they in the hospital,
No,
or
they're in hospitals and in clinical practice. Yeah,
but they
so
weren't overwhelmed by.
no, they certainly weren't overwhelmed. And of course, we built our Nightingale hospitals around the same time as the Chinese built theirs in January 2019, no, 2020, sorry. And ours the Chinese had closed theirs by April, and ours was still open a year later. There's a King's Fund report just showing what a huge waste of money that was. So the Chinese were not overwhelmed by it at all. They made contingency plans, realized they didn't need these extra hospitals in Wuhan, and they were gone within 2 or 3 months.
What
Uh,
was the? I mean, clearly you would build these extra hospitals and the Nightingale thing, which I think was in the East End of London there. if you were told that there's going to be a mass
Yeah,
pandemic and there's
yeah,
going to be hundreds of thousands of people desperately in need of ventilators, which is what
yes,
I think did happen. Where did
yeah.
all that then come from, if even in Wuhan itself there wasn't that kind of thing happening?
Yeah, well, it came from Neil Ferguson's modelling from Imperial College. That was what led to it all. And Neil Ferguson, who'd already got what was it? He got the BSE wrong. He got foot and mouth wrong, and he had three. He's got a track record before that of having of predicting three three dreadful occurrences in the country, none of which happened. All of which, especially the last foot and mouth, which was in the last big foot and mouth, which was 2000, 1999 to 2000 when I first came to Hull. I remember seeing the funeral pyres in the countryside, the smoke going up, millions of cattle destroyed for no good reason. And BSE likewise. So he was trusted with coming up with the figures for
You think
COVID.
we'd learned something from that? But of course, it wasn't just Neil Ferguson, because this was
No.
happening across the world. It wasn't just our
Yes.
France,
Yes.
Germany. They were locking down, closing up
Yes. Yeah.
doors.
Yes, I know. The news seemed to spread very fast. I mean, the latest theory, a book by a woman called Debbie Lerman from the Brownstone Institute,
Oh
uh,
yeah.
produces very good evidence to show that the response in the USA wasn't, in fact, a public health response, but it was a tried and a well-rehearsed desktop military exercise, a bioterrorism exercise. And it's a very convincing book. The one thing she doesn't say is why it happened this way. And if I think finally, and she doesn't claim that COVID was created to create that situation. Her claim would be that it just came along at a time when they thought, right, this is the one that we're going to test this all out on. And there is other evidence, and some of it she points to in her book, that NATO was responsible to some extent for coordinating the exercise. So that would explain the whole of Europe going mad over this. So I think there was a huge big argument within the COVID skeptic community and the lockdown skeptic community between the cock-up theorists and the conspiracy theorists, and I don't think this was a cock-up, and conspiracy is a loaded word, but I certainly think it was coordinated. It's impossible to see otherwise how it could have happened like that.
Yes, I spoke to Jeffrey Tucker of the Brownstone
Yeah,
Institute, and
yeah,
his view is much the same, that there was some kind of, it's almost the
yes,
military response was triggered, as
yes,
if there
yes,
was some kind of, I don't know, warning, there's
yeah,
some um,
yes, yes.
warfare event.
Perhaps they knew something we didn't know, but uh,
Oh.
but I don't think so, as it turned out.
So, looking back on the COVID
Yeah,
times then, we did lock down
yeah,
and we did tell people that they should wear masks wherever
yes,
they went,
yes,
on pain of some sanction. They should separate themselves from by 6 feet from
yeah,
anybody else at least.
yes,
Um, what did you make of all of that at the time and
yes. Well,
now?
I mostly laughed my head off, but because there was not a shred of evidence for any of this. I seem to be in all the hot spots at all the wrong times. My wife and I were in Hong Kong the very day that SARS kicked off. We were actually staying in the complex where it was found,
Wow.
and then. But my point is that I went home very soon after that. But people started wearing face masks, and I checked with senior colleagues in Hong Kong. What is the evidence for face masks? This was in 2003, and they said absolutely none, and it remains the same today. And a review done since COVID shows that. But we knew there was no evidence for certainly the kind of mask that we were wearing, these cloth masks, 'cause they can't possibly work. There's a space here. You can see in the side. You can feel your breath coming out there. So I thought this was utterly bizarre. That we should be doing this, and also the social distancing. Viruses, if viruses will just get everywhere. Social distancing won't make the slightest bit of difference to that. So it was all very bizarre, and I think two mentalities clash there, and they're very prominent in the public health lobby. One is we must do something, and we must be seen to be doing something. And of course, the other side of it was possibly at the behest of someone, NATO or the government or someone, the public health lobby did the best they could to engender fear in the population. People were genuinely terrified during that time. I know people who were, deeply terrified by the whole thing, by what I would now call propaganda. So I thought a lot of this was an exercise in propaganda and unevidence-based practice. And I just thought, I fell for the initial, 3-week period, thinking, oh, well, may as well just get on with it for 3 weeks. But of course, inevitably, it was extended for the best part of, 3 years. So I thought that was pretty disastrous. It was, I mean, the masks in particular, the 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 um, the European budget on face masks went up by something like 800%. It went from a few million to several billion. I did actually write this figure down. So European budget went up to from 800 million pounds to 14 billion pounds they spent on masks. So again, somewhere in behind this, some pressure to sell masks. I mean, we should have
But
invested in masks.
I suppose some of the hottest places who are, let's say, hottest on this particular thing of wearing masks were, of course, hospitals. You
Yes,
couldn't go
yeah,
into a hospital unless you actually wore a mask.
yeah.
And of course, people in hospitals and nurses and such like routinely wear masks and such. So why would why would it not be appropriate, or why would it be useless to do so if the hospitals themselves were saying this is the important thing? You can't even come in without one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they also haven't studied the evidence. They've kind of fallen for it. There seems to be this is the problem with it, with a national health service, is that this kind of nonsense spreads very quickly and becomes policy very quickly. Again, people just weren't willing, Philip, to engage with the lack, not with the evidence, but the lack of evidence for this, and people were even willing to say things like, well, it's a symbol, we're showing people we care, that kind of thing. This sort of nonsense went about. So, of course, if people see people in hospitals doing, they think it's the right thing to do, and of course, it's a very nice clinical symbol to be wearing a face mask, and I think people got used to this sense of drama about the whole thing. It just increased that sense of drama. Um, and yeah, some health services, some hospitals are still wearing masks and still requesting people to do it. Um,
Well, what I find really
mm,
worrying, I mean, I have a scientific background,
yeah,
and I know the importance of
yeah,
evidence-based conclusions that you come.
yes,
But that's multiplied tenfold when you get into the medical sphere. Medical science requires evidence of a much stronger nature because, after all, if you get it wrong, you
yeah,
actually might kill somebody. So it's very important to get your conclusions right in a medical situation. It doesn't matter so much if a physicist gets it wrong, but if a medical person gets it wrong, doctor gets it wrong, then you've got a real problem here. And yet here we
mm,
have a situation where they were not following evidence-based practice. In the place where they have double-blind testing, where they have all the
mm.
proper restrictions and restraints upon getting the conclusions right, they were not following the evidence. How is that explainable?
Oh, yes. Well, herd mentality, um, virtue signaling. There seems to be a propensity for people who are on the left of politics and slightly liberal to be much more in favour of these measures. It's extraordinary. They seem to be much easier to persuade to do things which are illiberal than people they would accuse of being fascists or whatever, and maybe polarising things a bit there. But yeah, I think it remains a mystery as to why. But not only that, but getting so aggressive with people who wouldn't do it. And I think they feared people like myself who wouldn't wear a mask because we were showing them up. I wasn't doing it to be a hero, but people got really angry, and
You didn't wear masks.
sorry.
You didn't wear a mask either in public
No,
transport?
the only time I wore a mask, I wore one very briefly during the first 3 weeks, flattening the sombrero, whatever, because I thought I don't want to make it awkward for people in these restaurants. You know, they
Yeah.
want us to wear a mask. Why not? And I got heavily criticised by a friend for doing so. After that, I simply refused. The only time I wore a mask was when I flew, because I knew I was told I'd get arrested at the other end once on Lufthansa flight going through Berlin if I didn't put a mask on.
Did you get into any trouble with your employers, brother?
Yes, I got into huge trouble with my employers over taking part in a lockdown rally in Hull. I took part in two. I didn't get any trouble over masks because we didn't have to go into work, so nobody knew. But I was very prominent in writing about this, and I spoke at two rallies in Hull, criticising lockdown. I got reported to the University of Hull for one, and my head was called for on a plate. And had it not been for Toby Young intervention, I was an early member of the Free Speech Union. I
Yeah,
think
I
I would have.
remember that.
I think I would not have made it to retirement, quite frankly, because the response I got from the university was, I quote, "Why the hell did you have to tell Toby Young about this?" So it obviously frightened them off, you know. But then after that, beyond that, then I was reported to the Nursing and Midwifery Council for spreading disinformation. In other words, spreading evidence-based practice. And I had an 8-month wait before, again, the Free Speech Union, I'm sure it was their intervention. I had no case to answer after 8 months, but the process was the punishment in that case. So I was threatened with being struck off the register for a while. So yeah, I got in
I mean,
trouble for my
I
views.
mean, all of this is not only incredibly worrying, but
Yeah.
it's incredibly surprising too,
Yeah.
because
Yes.
in a place like the NHS and in these kind of institutions, they actually have charters for whistleblowers, don't they?
Yes. Yes.
They
Yeah.
have a set of procedures for
Mm,
people to be able to say, wait a minute, this is wrong. This is a bad practice.
yes.
This is
Yeah.
actually harming people. This
Yeah.
is not working. And there's a big cover up going on so
Mm,
that I need to, become public with
yeah.
this.
Yeah.
And yet, in this very institution where an NHS, where whistleblowers are meant to be protected, you
Yes.
now find that the exact opposite really is the case. I was reading a statistic saying that 61% of doctors now say, that's in 2024, would not raise concerns because they were afraid of the consequences.
Mm,
That was the
mm,
BMA
mm.
came up with that. Does that astonish you?
Doesn't astonish me at all, because I think the NHS is a sort of neo-Stalinist organisation run by run from the centre basically, and I just think it's a huge juggernaut, which the country worships. We all know the story about the Britain being attached to its health service rather than the other way around. And I just think the NHS is completely out of control. I think it's there to serve itself basically, and not the people. That doesn't mean to say that the individual nurses and doctors are not there to help people, but I think the organisation itself
But
is
there are
yeah,
so many cases now of people who are
yeah,
under investigation or have been investigated. I was looking at Dr. Sam White,
yes,
erased from the register for raising concerns about lockdowns and vaccines. And
yes,
Dr.
yes.
Asim Malhotra,
Malhotra, yeah, yeah,
fitness to practice panel he's had to face. Dr.
mm,
Chris Day, a whistleblower,
yeah,
still after 11 years hasn't had a proper outcome. And doctors who've spoken about the
yeah,
recklessness of giving mRNA vaccines to
yes,
young children who
yes,
didn't have any
yes,
risk from the virus,
yes.
from what we can now know,
Mm.
have all been referred to the Counter Disinformation Unit,
Yes, yes. Oh, that's right. That's right. Yes, that's what
including
happens when
yourself by the sound of it.
Yes, exactly. And just last night, I was on the way. I was in Rome, traveling back, and that's irrelevant. But I was answering WhatsApp's message from a friend and colleague who's over at a major nursing conference in Europe just now, the International Council of Nurses, who was approached by a colleague. I won't name any of them, but approached by another former colleague of mine to be told that she shouldn't be associating or working with me because I was an anti-vaxxer, and she shouldn't have published something by me because I was an anti-vaxxer, which is not true actually. But you get labelled and set aside and ignored. So that's a sort of informal process. But I think you're absolutely right. It's extraordinary that there seems to be so little room for speaking out, and COVID kind of focused that. It seemed like the perfect excuse that people needed to stamp down on this kind of thing. We're suffering an existential threat. Everybody's got to pull together. We're on like a wartime footing, and deserters will be shot or whatever, or spies will be shot on sight. And if you're not with us, you're completely against us. And you had to be 100% on people's side on this. You had to agree that lockdowns were good, masks worked, social distancing was necessary, and the vaccines were the best thing since sliced bread. And any chink in that particular armor, and I didn't go for any of it, and you were cast out. You were a heretic basically. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, do you think people have learned lessons from that? Looking, back today,
Yeah.
back to 2025, a few years later on. I read another statistic which I thought quite interesting, that only 18% of the NHS staff have taken up the COVID booster vaccines this year.
Yes.
Only 18%,
Yes.
which
Yes.
makes it what, 82%
Yeah.
have refused it or not bothered
Yes.
with it.
Yeah.
Have people come to their senses a bit more, do you think, or is that
Yeah.
telling us something different?
No, I think they definitely have, but of course they cannot. They can quietly refuse to take it because they know nothing will happen to them. Thankfully, unlike the nursing home
Until the
staff.
next time.
Yeah, yes. Next time round, I wonder. Yes, I would like to think that next time round, people will not comply with these kind of things. If there is a next time round, I think maybe this. I'm hoping, maybe I'm wrong, but I wonder if the people who implement and plan these kind of things have completely shot their bolt now. They've done it, and people are wise to it. I don't know, but I think the fact that people are not taking the vaccine is a quiet protest. Is not doing something, but by the same token, they will not say they're not taking it because they believe the mRNA vaccines are potentially harmful, which they are. So it's probably the only way they can protest, and they also see that they don't work. I mean, it's patently obvious that the mRNA vaccines don't work. But yeah, but I think it's next time round. I don't think the government could. I don't know about the NHS. The NHS probably has its ways and means, called your salary at the end of the month if you don't comply. But for the general public, I really don't think they will ever be able to do this to us again. I really don't. But maybe I'm deluded because, most people who are not in my circle, who I encounter elsewhere, and, working in China, I've just been in Italy, I work in Spain, people just talk about the pandemic. It just rolls off the tongue. And I always take that as a mark of people who haven't really thought it through, because it wasn't really a pandemic at all. They don't point to the restrictions as having caused the problems. They point to COVID and the pandemic. So yeah, so I think
What
it's fixed.
what I think upset me the most is the lack of clear thinking
Yes,
about things, the lack of nuanced thinking,
yes,
the lack of proper investigation and clarity of thought,
yeah,
and that most people are very happy just to
yeah,
go along with the herd because that's
yes,
what most people do. And that's
yeah,
an incredibly
yeah,
disturbing thing
yes,
to
yes,
appreciate about society at large.
yeah,
That it's so susceptible
yes,
to just a herd mentality rather
yes,
than a thinking, rational,
yeah.
nuanced mentality.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah. People have been lulled into this sense that the government knows best. Well, maybe not the government, but I think if it's a health message, particularly, and I know what you've said has got wider implications, but if it's a health message, they really just believe uncritically what they're told. And it can be used, as we've seen, to manipulate millions of people into doing things which are completely unnecessary and in many cases very, very harmful. And it is worrying. You know, people do get lulled by all this, almost anaesthetized by it, and maybe that's the way that societies become. You know, I think we're much less willing to question things these days than we were before. We watch too much television. We've got the opium of the television, and of course, not only the opium of the television and all the Netflix box sets, which I'm prone to watching myself sometimes, but the news, which I never watch now, the mainstream news, they pump these messages out with enthusiasm. You know, they just went along with it completely. And back to COVID, particularly, the mainstream media, to their shame, I mean, the mainstream newspapers, the broadsheets, including papers like the Telegraph, which are now willing to be a little bit critical, and magazines like the Spectator, they just went along with the whole thing. There wasn't about a whole year there wasn't a critical word came out of these organs, which just shows you that something was being done to make sure they didn't. It must have been.
It is rather like a war
Yes.
mentality where
Yeah.
anything which is like dissent
Yes.
to the view is considered to
Yes.
be seditious.
Yes. Oh, completely. Yes. Yes.
And that's why you get ostracized. But
Yeah.
that was the real problem here. There was,
Yeah.
I mean, I came to the conclusion only through looking back at COVID that although most people are reasonably intelligent, it's what I've come to label superficial intelligence.
Yes.
And that
Yes.
real intelligence or deeper intelligence requires the asking of questions.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Question almost everything. When
Yes.
I taught at the university, the research methods unit, I had a motto for the course, which was taken from the Royal Society, which said nullius in verba, which means take
Mm.
nobody's word for it. And
Yes.
I would tell the students that if I could get them to question everything by the time they left, I'd consider my job well done. But most people don't question anything. That was the point you were making. Most people just accept uncritically and unquestioningly, even though they're reasonably intelligent people,
Yeah.
they accept whatever they're told, which is
Yeah.
incredibly worrying.
Very. I think there's probably a a strong correlation of about zero point 0.9 with the significance of you know, p less than goodness knows what between people's IQ and the extent to which they accepted the COVID restriction.
Which is again
Yeah.
worrying.
Yeah, I mean, there was no lack of intelligence amongst some of the senior medics who would, you know, cancelled me on Twitter and things like that. I don't doubt their ability as medics, but they
But
wouldn't.
they don't ask questions of things themselves. They just go along with it.
Odd, yeah. I teach on an evidence-based course in Italy, and I turned up to teach this, and I refused to wear a mask in Italy, which got me into a bit of trouble there. But I turned up, and all the students are wearing masks, and I just said, "Okay, before we start today's lecture on meta-analysis or whatever it was, why are you all wearing masks?" You know, and you know, well, it's the university's rules. Yeah, okay, but why is that rule? And but do you believe that? And oh yes, yes, we believe they make us safe. But to a man and a woman, and one woman was particularly vociferous against me for not for not wearing one, but in arguing back. I said, "Have you read any Cochrane reviews on the effectiveness of masks?" No. You know, would you? No, because I believe they work. You know, people weren't just, I'm just repeating what you said, they were not willing to engage with the evidence at all. They didn't want their mindset shifted on this one because I don't know why. I don't know
I
why.
wanted to ask you particularly about masks in passing, because I know you've written recently
Yes.
upon this. There was a very important study by Cochrane, and I forget the
Yes.
name of the lead. The
Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson, that's right.
Yeah.
He came out very clearly and said there is no evidence to
Yes.
support the use of masks
Yeah.
in this kind of an environment. It doesn't do anything.
Yes.
But more recently, there has been another study which has been written which contradicts that one.
Yes.
And that's
Yes.
by, is it Green, someone or other?
Trisha Greenall, who I know very well. Yes.
Okay, well, now she's written this study which says, yes,
Yes.
masks play a very important role.
Yes. Yes.
And how do you reconcile those two? How does one say one thing and one say the opposite?
Okay, well, one is called a systematic review and meta-analysis, and the other was a sort of evolution. I can't remember how they describe it. It's got. I've just written an article for the Daily Sceptic. It was published last week on this because I analysed them
Yeah, I've
both
read
with
it.
both in great detail. I've forgotten how Greenhalgh and et al. Described the review. It doesn't really matter. But the process that they used was to start with the answer. Basically, they gathered a group of people, all of whom clearly believed in the mask narrative, and asked them to produce papers which essentially showed that masks worked. They mined those for the references which supported that, and then put out what they called a sort of call on social media, a crowdsourcing way of getting information to ask other people for essentially for articles showing that masks worked. And I'm not misrepresenting the process at all there, as far as I can see. And of course, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. People just sent them in lots of articles which showing that they worked. They described the Jefferson process as controversial, yet
I
the
would call it scientific, wouldn't
it's
you?
it's the gold standard, for goodness sake.
Yes.
Of course, Tricia herself, who I know, I've personally got nothing against Tricia. I'm sure she hasn't got much time for me. She's made some very valuable contributions, and I have actually worked with her. She's made her own contribution to Cochrane Review. She's led them, and she's been part of it. So,
Where she had to use these very tools of
yes, yeah,
no,
yeah, yeah, and
sifting out the evidence, making sure that you've got stuff which is blind
yes,
testing, all those kind
yes,
of
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And of course, Jefferson's claims are more modest because he says there's an absence of evidence. We do not have robust evidence that these work. It's completely absent. But of course, Greenhalgh and colleagues started with the assumption that they did work, and this is how we're going to show it. And that doesn't mean to say they don't work. I mean, science is an argument, but the studies that they used were not randomized controlled trials, basically. They lacked controls, and there's all sorts of biases and confounders can be brought in there.
Let's move on to a related area, which is that if we move on from COVID, the last pandemic,
Yes.
we were threatened quite recently with a new pandemic,
Yeah.
which is, of course, what used to be called monkeypox,
Yes.
which people didn't take terribly seriously, so they
Yes.
felt they needed to rename it as MPox.
Yes. Yes.
And that's been held out as being something which we should all be terribly afraid of.
Yes.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of desperation amongst the pro-vaccine lobby, probably the manufacturers, to point to something that requires, because the answer to all these things is vaccination. It's always vaccination. But if you look at MPox or monkeypox, I'd keep calling it monkeypox. It's very hard to catch it. It's very mild if you get it, and it really doesn't threaten anybody. The people who've died are the usual suspects. I don't mean to be disrespectful to anybody who's died with it, possibly not of it. People whose immune systems are compromised, and the people who catch it. And it's even the same. Yesterday, a report was put out in Global Health Now newsletter from the John Hopkins Bloomberg School on MPox in Africa, and it's still predominantly spread by sexual routes. And the numbers of people dying are exceedingly small across the whole of Africa. It's in the hundreds, probably dying with and not of. And the latest news was that in one part of Africa, it was overwhelming the health service. But this was in a very poor country. It was the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, where it was overwhelming the health service. But as far as I know, there's not much of a health service there to overwhelm in the first place. So, I'm not being disparaging about these places, but again, I think monkeypox was just another effort to get us all concerned about the potential for a global pandemic, and then the need to all get vaccinated against it. Because the people who are dying in the Democratic Republic are women who've caught it possibly from their partners, and babies who have caught it possibly from their mothers, and they're both notoriously undernourished. So the answer isn't vaccines. The answer there is probably to get these people better nutrition, but that, of course, is a long-term solution. Vaccines are a short-term solution.
Right. So Do you think that this is one of those things which will just disappear as far as fear is concerned?
Yeah, oh, I think so. I think people have been people. The wolf has been pointed to too often on these things. I think, and people, people saw around them during COVID people who had COVID, but they're not seeing people dropping in the streets with monkeypox. It just isn't a problem really. So, I think it's their efforts to whip up fear or enthusiasm for vaccines over that one has completely failed. But that isn't stopping the vaccine companies from selling vast amounts of vaccines to Africa or sending them there under the auspices of Bill Gates and his crew, um, untested, largely untested, and beginning to develop mRNA type vaccines for MPox. So the same old story is being repeated.
Is this all about making money, or is there something else
Oh,
behind
I'm
it?
sure it's all about making money. I'm absolutely sure. It's sold to us. The vaccine campaigns are sold to us as sort of charitable ventures. I mean, when the COVID vaccines were developed, they were supposed to be not for profit, but Pfizer and Moderna made millions at the time. So I don't know how they reconcile those two things. People point to the great philanthropist Bill Gates and how he invests all his money in this, and it's done off the back of his foundation. But Bill Gates continues to get richer and not poorer, despite giving all his money away. So I think it's all to do with money. But
I
ultimately, it's
believe
not.
he plans to give it away
Yeah,
by is it
yeah,
2045, which by
right.
my reckoning, because he's born in the same year that I was,
Yes.
1955, he'll be 90 years old, I think.
Right. Okay. Yes, I was born in 1955 as well, so we're all the same. Yes, he plans to give it away by then. Sadly, if he does give it away, he'll be giving it to things which I don't think we should be looking forward to, like blotting out the sun and yet more vaccines.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it is about making money. The production of vaccines, by these companies, it costs money, and they're very unwilling to release the actual amount of money they get for the vaccines. There are estimates of how much they get, but you can calculate their bottom line, the top line, sorry, in billions of dollars if you go multiply the number of doses that are being sold around the world by the sort of average amount of money they get for a dose. I don't know what their bottom line, I don't know what the profit margin is on that, but it's probably still in the lower billions. So yeah, it's I'm sure money is a huge motivator.
Makes sense. Before we finish, Roger, I've got a couple more uh, different questions on different topics, but all related to the NHS, which I'd like your views on.
Okay.
One of the cases which has come up within the last few months or so is the difficult case of Lucy Letby,
Ah, yes, yes,
the nurse who is supposed to have and is in prison for I think 34 years for
yes,
killing, is it
yes,
7 babies and injuring
yes.
other ones. What's your
Yeah.
view on that?
Yeah, it's a tragic case. One of your previous interviewees, Neil McRae, who
Yeah.
you remember interviewing recently, he within 24 hours of the verdict being published, he was on to this straight away, saying something doesn't seem right here. I wasn't sure. I hadn't really taken much interest in it up to that point. I think he's right now. And now I've taken a great deal more interest. I've read the Private Eye report by Phil Hammond. And I don't particularly like Phil Hammond. He's not as funny a comedian as he thinks, and he's not as good a commentator as he thinks. But if Private Eye on the one hand are very doubtful about the veracity of the convictions.
I did interview someone called John Quigley, Professor John Quigley of
Yeah,
UCL, who's a statistician, who
yes,
came to the very strong conclusion that
yes,
statistically,
yes.
she's no different from any other nurse,
No,
which I
no,
thought was
no,
an interesting conclusion.
no, absolutely not. I mean, she was on there for all the well. They've tied her, the shifts when she was on, they've tied into babies dying, but I believe there are shifts when she wasn't there when babies died as
Yes,
well.
that's right, but they
Um,
eliminated those ones from consideration.
yes, and that I don't understand. But when you get people like Private Eye on the one hand, which is increasingly left wing, someone like Peter Hitchens, who certainly isn't on the left, all casting doubt over this, and Lord Sumption coming out and saying quite simply, I think the woman is innocent, there's a good chance that she's innocent, you've got to begin to question it. And as far as I can see from reading the reports and things, the report put together by David Davis, which I did read, there doesn't actually seem to be a shred of evidence that she killed anyone. It's an extraordinary affair.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the fact that her expert witness wasn't called points to something going. I don't know why that was. Nobody really understands. And the fact that she's not being allowed to appeal is the other thing. It's not, her appeals are not being permitted. So I think it's a very doubtful case. I think I should probably take the Peter Hitchens line and say, I don't know if she's innocent or guilty, but I don't think there's evidence based on what I've seen that would say it was even worth an internal inquiry. It just seems all circumstantial and dubious from a statistical point of view.
Another case which has been in the news quite recently about the NHS is the case about nurses who have taken the NHS authority to court for dismissing their gender critical views. As one nurse, I think Sandy Peggy from
Yes.
Fife,
Yeah.
doesn't like the idea of having to share changing rooms with a trans
Yes.
person.
Yeah.
And considering the recent report from or adjudication from the Supreme Court, they also seem to side with her. Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that issue?
I think it's a disgrace. I think this is a clear indication of the NHS thinking, on the one hand, it's above the law, that it makes the law, and that it's that it seems to be an organisation which is there not to look after the population and to care for our health, but to implement this kind of we've avoided the word so far, but this sort of woke mentality, this intersectional nonsense whereby whatever you say is right and whoever you say you are is who you are. So I think it's absolutely disgraceful that the NHS is not protecting its nurses from the potential of having a man changing in your changing room,
Yeah.
So I'm completely 100% on the side of the nurse you mentioned and of the other nurse in England whose name I've forgotten now.
Yeah.
But the Christian nurse who said it's against her Christian principles to call a man a woman. The man who called her by the N word and abused her. She said to the doctor he, and she got reported by the doctor for referring to the man as he. I mean, this is insanity. But again, this is the kind of insanity perpetuated by an organisation like the NHS, which is out of control. I think completely out of control.
But it, how do we make sense of it in the sense of, why would people act in this irrational way?
Well, they've been brainwashed. They've been if they've been through universities, they've been which most of them will have been. They've been educated into this sort of monoculture of rights a man can be a woman, whatever there's a whole culture behind this. There's a whole machinery behind this, and again, trying to avoid using the word woke, but we all know what we mean. This woke machinery swings into action, and it's everywhere. It's in corporate bodies, it's in universities, it's in the health service, and the kind of people. It's very well explained by Joanna. I shouldn't have started saying her name. The woman who writes for Spiked, Joanna Williams, I think it is, in her book about woke. She
Yes,
said,
I've interviewed her as well. Interesting.
yes,
She
yes.
said the same kind of thing.
Yeah, well, she says that because the same people move between these organizations seamlessly. So, and they're the people who are in the human resources departments, usually in big corporations, the NHS and the universities. And they're the people who bring in these policies and implement them and spend an inordinate amount of time putting on staff development courses where people are fed this stuff. And of course, people sit there shaking their heads and saying this is nonsense, But of course, at the end of the day, they've got your wage packet in their hand, and that's how it gets done. So I
I've got
think
a
it's
I've got a
coercion.
theory about why woke has taken off, and which I want to pass it before you, because I think you might have something to say about it. That is, my view is that first of all, you can't understand the woke thing unless you appreciate the fact that it's really generated by strong moral principles.
Yes.
That these people genuinely believe it's the moral thing to do to help, say, the downtrodden in society, the weaker
Yes.
members, the minority groups in society, that is the good thing, the virtuous thing, and the right thing to do. And that these are people who desperately want to be seen to be doing the good and to be seen to be doing the right thing because they're morally impelled to do that.
Mm.
Now, my second string to this bow argument is this then comes down to a failure of the Christian principles in the sense that society has fundamentally rejected them. For
Mm.
2,000 years, we've had a Judeo-Christian moral core to the country, which
Mm.
for whatever reason, over the last 20 years or so, has been rejected by society. And Christianity has therefore failed to convince people that this is the moral standard. So they've replaced it with a different moral standard. And the different moral standard happens to be this woke moral standard.
Mm.
But there is this need to be good, to be
Mm.
virtuous. And if you can't do it by being Christian in that approach, then this is the alternative way to do that.
Mm.
That's my theory on the matter. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, well, you can certainly, and Andrew Doyle does it very well in his not his most recent book on woke, but his previous one, that it's got all the hallmarks of a religion. You know, it's got heresy. Those of us who don't necessarily agree with these things, it's got a crowd mentality. It's got its icons. It's got its rubrics. It's got its principles, if that's the word. And I think you're right. I often I often find it difficult to say it's coming from a good place in these people who want to do good. But I think the second bit that you added to that was they want to be seen to be doing good. I think that's a very powerful motivation as well, because there's people looking over the fence. So I think often it's again this crowd mentality, the whole virtue signaling aspect of it, to be seen to be out competing people to be woke, because there's nothing else anchoring them or pulling them back. For instance, Judeo-Christian principles, which are very clear, a lot simpler. But also have other aspects to them, about morality and the relationship between men and women, these kind of things. There's other bits of that they've kind of rejected. And I think that the lead up to this, I mean, the whole, I suppose, the 60s, which we lived through as young kids, was one thing. But then I think the whole New Age movement was another thing leading to this, because that was clearly a religion substitute as well. So I think there's been a few of these things have come along, but they've been sort of minority interests. People have looked rather stupid for being involved in them, but woke really seems to fit a broad spectrum of organizations and people. This is the one that's really taken off. And of course, it's not a matter of left or right, because our Tory government that went out recently, they were just about as woke as you could possibly get. They've done more to implement this woke stuff than probably Starmer's done since he came
Which is
in.
a big surprise in and of itself.
Yes, yes.
Roger, we're coming to the last couple of minutes. I've got one last question for you, if I may. And that is that if I could ask you to pretend that you were suddenly elevated to the position of chief executive of the NHS, or maybe even the Minister for Health, what change, maybe one change, or a couple of changes, would you seek to implement to try to improve what we have at the moment? Is there something which comes to mind?
Yes, yes, good Lord. If I was chief executive, I'd probably sack myself. And if I was the minister, I'd probably sack the chief executive. I mean, that I have to say that's a really hard question because
There's no simple fix, is what you're saying then.
yeah, I think the NHS is beyond fixing, to be absolutely honest.
Well, start again.
Start again. I really do. And
Which
that's not.
model do you prefer? The French model, the American model?
Yeah, well, I mean, the American model has got its problems, but it's not as bad as people think. I hear very good reports from France and the health service there. Theodore Dalrymple writes very well about
Yeah,
it,
yeah, I
but
read him.
but I've spent a lot of time in Australia. I work part-time there. They've got the Medicaid and Medicare system. Nobody seems to go without care. It's not hugely expensive. There are no waiting lists and people get excellent care. There are some things crumbling around care of older people and one or two things in Australia which are not so good. And of course, don't mention COVID regarding Australia. That was an aberration. But as a general health system, that seems to work well. I think so. I don't think there's anything we can do to fix the NHS. There has to be a sense of a cushion for people who can't afford healthcare. There also has to be a sense of contribution that you can see, not just not out of my tax to pay for someone else's, or as I get increasingly frail and old, out of somebody else's taxes to pay for me. Because it's not a system with any sense of investment in it. The money doesn't grow. Mrs. Thatcher saw this crystal clearly. I don't think she had the right answer, which was to privatise the whole thing. And I know for a fact she was pulled back from the brink of that by people like Caroline Cox, who's now in the Lords or has been there for a long time, who's very libertarian and right wing, but they said, no, that's just not going to work. But something that provides a cushion, but people have some sense of responsibility, is all. So, I don't think there's a quick fix, Philip. That would be mine. We need to stop what we're doing and do something completely different. But it will never happen. I don't think we're wedded to it.
Roger Watson, thank you very much indeed for
Thank you very much, Philip.
today
Pleasure.
and talk today.